So today we're going to be talking about overall this different approach to getting into the top universities in the U.S. We're going to start by breaking down the Harvard admissions trial, which is this case that has been it's actually still ongoing, but it's been going on for a number of years now in the U.S. That really started because Asian Americans and Asian students in general, both domestic and international students, levied a case against Harvard, claiming that the stakes for Asian students are it's much harder for Asian students to get into Harvard with this exact same scores. That they actually need to be a little bit like 120, 150 more points on the SAT to be even in the same category as students of other ethnicities. So that's sort of the origin of that case. But because of this, a lot of documents, a lot of things that were once secret, tightly held secrets by Harvard, are now public information. And so we'll take a look at that and kind of dissect the findings. Second part is we're going to talk about like what do these findings mean, and how does that change our strategy, our approach to preparing for these top universities. And then the third part is we'll do a very quick introduction to the Spike Lab and the work that we do to help students. All right, so a very quick introduction about me. My name is Larry. I am a former teacher. Went to the University of Michigan, where I studied neuroscience and English. Got my teaching certificate and master's degree from Columbia Teachers College. Taught for the US for 6 years, teaching mostly AP psychology, AP English, and IB physics. So very experienced in both AP and IB formats. Started my first company, which we called Pomegranate Lab, where we did teacher training and school design. And through that, I had the privilege to coach over 50 early stage startups. Right now, I'm the co-founder of the Spike Lab and one of the coaches. All right, so part one, unpacking the Harvard trial. So you may not recognize this man here, but he is pretty famous, notoriously famous in the U.S. Because a lot of these college court cases, he is the lawyer for, and pretty controversial. So whether no matter what side of the like the legal spectrum you come from, this case actually represents a very unique opportunity for not just Asian students, but just for students in general, because Harvard, for the first time ever, has had to release its secret formula, its method for how they select students. As part of the court documents, they have detailed rubrics, complete with admissions officer handwritten notes and everything about just exactly what they're looking for in terms of students. And so this is kind of similar to as if Coca-Cola like released their secret formula. It's kind of on that level. And so we went through all the legal documents and really analyzing them, breaking them down, and kind of summed it up for all of you. If any of you are interested in like reading the original documentation, feel free to reach out to us. We have many of these files in PDF format. So if you have the time or the interest to really dive deep and peruse through them, feel free to reach out. All right, so today we're going to be using Harvard as the main backdrop, but the process that we're going to be talking about actually pertains not just to Harvard, but also Yale, Princeton, Brown, Columbia, Cornell, UPenn, and Dartmouth, the Ivy League. And actually, we're going to do a super quick poll to boost audience participation and engagement. We're going to do a quick pop quiz about if anybody knows why the Ivy League was first formed. Is it because they wanted to exchange students? Is it because they wanted to do profit sharing? Is it because they wanted to do research together? Or is it because of athletics? So take a quick moment. We're going to leave this up for about 5 seconds, and so just put your guess in. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last chance vote. All right, let's close it. What are the results? All right, so 50-50 split between research and athletics. The real reason is athletics. So the Ivy League first began because they wanted to have a standardized way of recruiting athletes. Because, for example, Harvard didn't want Princeton to recruit a whole bunch of like really awesome basketball players who are really bad at school. And so together, all of these 8 original universities in the United States decided on one common standard for what how they would admit students. And to this day, all 8 schools still follow the same standard. And so because of this Harvard case, they basically released how the entire Ivy League selects students. But then in addition to the Ivy League, other top universities like Stanford, Hopkins, Duke, MIT, all of these schools, they actually share. They don't officially share the same techniques, but they learn from each other. They observe each other's methodologies. And so other top universities adopt very similar screening processes for students because they're all so competitive and they're all trying to recruit the top students from around the world. And so some of the things that you hear today in this webinar may be at odds with some of the other things that you've heard with regards to US universities. And it's not to say that they are wrong or we are right, but the reality is that this seminar is related or is pertaining to top tier US universities. And the strategy for the top tier universities is fundamentally different from the middle tier universities. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. So Harvard's method, boiled down, is actually quite simple. There are 4 main categories that Harvard will examine for every student. The first one is academic. This is everything that relates to school and what happens in the classroom in particular. And so this is composed of your GPA, so all of your classes across all 4 years of high school, your ACT or SAT, and then your SAT2s, and then a fourth, which they call academic activities. These are any activities, things that you do outside of the classroom, but are still academic in nature. And so these are things like writing research papers or participating in certain Olympiads like chemistry Olympiad or geography Olympiad. These are all academic activities to the admissions office. And so that is all the academic category. And then extracurricular. Extracurricular is everything that is done outside of the classroom. This can be connected to the school, such as clubs and student organizations, or it can be done independently. So doing certain sports, Boy Scouts, anything that is just the student does outside of the classroom will be counted in the extracurricular category. The third one, personal. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Personal is kind of the catch-all category. It contains a lot of different things. Such as your character, whether or not you've faced and overcome hardships in your life, whether or not your teachers like you, whether or not your peers like you, your leadership experience, all of these things are rolled into the personal category. And so to kind of sum it up, to simplify it a little bit, we like to describe personal as simply how interesting you are. Because at the end of the day, admissions officers, they are still people, and people will find certain things interesting and other things not interesting. And so if the admissions officer reads your application and their first reaction is, wow, that's so cool, then naturally you'll score very high in the personal section, and conversely, if you don't come across as interesting, then your personal score will tend to be lower. And we'll unpack this a lot more throughout the seminar. So we'll move on to athletic. So today we're actually not going to talk very much about athletics because athletic is a whole separate like scoring process. But the kind of the take-home message here is that when it comes to athletics for college admissions, it's a very binary situation where you're either going to be recruited or you're not. And if you're recruited, then you have a very, very high chance of getting in. But if you're not going to be recruited, then your athletic participation actually doesn't matter. And I want to put a caveat on that, in that it's not that the experience doesn't matter, it's the sport itself. That is that the colleges do not particularly care one way or the other. Of course, through the sport, you can accrue certain experiences, such as leadership or perseverance, work ethic. All of these things can be exhibited through your sport, but it's not the sport itself that matters so much if you're not good enough to be recruited. Okay, so that's the athletic section. So these are the four categories, the four main categories that Harvard will look at for every student. Within each category, the way scoring works is every category is scored from 1 to 6. 1 is the highest and 6 is the lowest. 1 is like world class. You're like extraordinary. To give you an idea of how difficult it is to get a 1 in any category, if you get a 1 in anything in the Harvard admissions scale, you have an overall 75% chance of getting in. And so it's extraordinarily difficult. To give an example with academics, if you have a 4.0 GPA, a 36 on your ACT, which is full, 1600 on your SAT, and all 1800s on your SAT2s, you will get a 2 in the academic section. And this is because you need the academic activities as well. And so it's extraordinarily difficult to get a 1 in anything. And if you are able to get a 1, then you have an overall 75% chance of getting in. So that is Harvard's method. So now we're going to use our newfound knowledge and test it out. Let's put on our admissions officers' hats and give it a try. Let's imagine that a student named Walter is applying to Harvard, and we are the admissions team. We get to score him and decide on Walter's fate when it comes to Harvard. So to give you, I'm going to sum up Walter's profile for you. So Walter academically, he has a 33 on the ACT, and he's in the top 10% of his graduating class at his high school. He is the president of his school's MUN club. They do conferences, multiple conferences throughout the year, and he helps organize all of them. He's also president of the Key Club at his school. And so he does a lot of communications with the school admin and the student body and coordinating between the various leadership bodies. And he's also the president of the National Honor Society at his school, and where he arranges a lot of the volunteer opportunities and coordinates a lot of the events and charities that the school participates in. And so he is very well liked by his teachers. All of his teachers, everybody loves Walter. His classmates also really like him. And then he is the captain of his school's varsity tennis team. They've competed regionally, locally, and then he is also the captain of his school's varsity swim team. And so this is Walter's profile. Take a moment to absorb all that he is. He's quite a strong candidate. Some of you might in the audience might be thinking like, wow, I wish my kid was more like Walter at this point. So now we are going to score him. So academic, extracurricular, personal, and athletic. Let's start with academic. So academic, we have a poll open. So how would we score him? Remember, 1 is the highest score, 6 is the lowest score. 1 is highest, 6 is lowest on Harvard's admissions scale. As an admissions office, what would we give him in terms of his academics? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Take a moment and make your choice. Let's see. Let's leave this open for 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Let's see the results. Wow. I'm sure almost all of you said that Walter would be a 2 academically. A few people said a 3. This is a very, very conservative group today. And so we would score Walter a 2 as well. And this is often a surprise that he already is scoring so high. A couple of you said that he might be getting a 3. The reality is that actually Harvard assigns a plus and a minus to each of these scores. And so there is a 2+ and 2-. So Walter would actually be closer to a 2- than a straight 2. But from this, we get the idea that Walter is already quite good. I mean, he's top 10% of his class, which is difficult. And 33 on his ACT is a very strong ACT score. And so Walter is already in the 2 range for academics. Let's think about extracurriculars now. Remember, he's MUN, Key Club, National Honor Society, presidencies in all 3 of them. Where would we score Walter for his extracurriculars? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Let's get our answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. All right. A majority of you this time said that he would be a 1 extracurricular because, after all, he is president of so many clubs. It doesn't get much better than being president. And so let's see what the Spike Lab team rated Walter. So we actually rated him a 3. This is usually a big kind of surprise moment because he's already, it feels like he's already doing everything he can be doing. So why is he still not a 1? Why is he so low, unexpectedly low? The reality is that one of the key factors for extracurricular ratings is your circle of influence, how much your activity has an impact on the community, on the world. And so the nature of many high school clubs is that their impact is inwardly facing. And so their purpose is mostly to serve the student body within the school. There are some clubs that are local facing, like National Honor Society is a very local impact. Some clubs are very regional impact. Some of them are national and some of them are international impact. And so the bigger your sphere of influence and your sphere of impact, the higher you can potentially score on the extracurricular section. Okay, personal. This is the next one. Let's score Walter. So 1 is the highest, and 6 is the lowest on personal. Remember, this one is a lot of factors: your character, your personality, your leadership experience, your how well you're liked by your teachers and your peers, your whether you've overcome extraordinary hardships, and overall, though, just how interesting you are. Okay, so 1 is the highest, 6 is the lowest. Let's get our answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. All right. So much more conservative. Somebody thought that he should be getting a 6, but a majority of you answered about a 2 for personal. And so we actually scored him roughly a 3 when it comes to personal. And here's why. So Walter, I mean, his profile is awesome. He's done so many great things, but in terms of interestingness, Walter is what we would call in the admissions world very common. That if just to give you an idea, if we were to ask you to close your eyes and imagine an overachieving Asian student, you would actually more or less guess Walter's profile. That whoever you're picturing is very close to Walter, and that actually hurts applicants because they are just a lot less unique. And thus less interesting, because the reality is these admissions officers, they read upwards to 50 applications per day. And if you are the 48th applicant that day, and your application looks very similar to all of the previous applicants that day, then you're almost immediately going to be forgotten. And so your personal score is going to be much lower. Okay. Athletic, we're not going to do a poll for, because, as we said earlier, we're not going to be addressing athletics in this seminar, and so we would actually give Walter about a 3. He's not going to be recruited, but he's pretty good still, and so he's right around in the middle. And so this is Walter's profile: 1, 2, and 3 3s. What chance would we estimate for Walter with regards to his chance of getting into Harvard? Does he have a 1% chance, a 5% chance, a 10%, 20, 50, 75% chance of getting in? All right, place your guesses in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Here we go. All right. A majority of you said that he has about a 50% chance of getting in. I mean, he's a very strong student. A couple of you said 5% chance. That's very close to Harvard's actual admittance rate of a 4 point, around 4.6. Varies from year to year. But majority of you said 5. Walter's actual chances of getting in, and we'll show you how we calculated this later on. But Walter's actual chance of getting in is about 10%. Okay, which is actually quite high, lower than 50. So it's usually a surprise that a student like Walter would only have a 10% chance still. But Walter is 10% is actually double the overall average. And so it's quite good, but it's still very hard. This is why for many top students, admittance into these very elite universities still feels like a game of chance, because at 10%, it is still roughly chance. And so that's Walter. Now, different student profile. This student, her name is Yanni, and she is also applying to Harvard. Real life Yanni did not end up applying to Harvard because she had like personal grievances against, she didn't like Harvard as a school. Her dream school was Wharton at UPenn, and she actually, as a high schooler, was applied directly into Wharton, which actually has a lower admittance rate than Harvard itself. Has about a 3 to 4% admittance rate. And so Yanni, let me just kind of explain her profile. So Yanni academically is very similar to Walter, but Yanni has a really extraordinary project that she put together called Kingswood Revolution. So when Yanni was very young, her father was working in Beijing, and because of air pollution, Yanni developed pollution-induced asthma from a very young age. And medically, there is no cure for that condition. And so since she was very young, she managed her asthma, kept it under control through fitness, through athletics. She played a lot of different sports, and that's how she kept those asthma attacks under control. And so she's always been very passionate about both sustainability, air pollution in particular, and fitness. And so Kingswood Revolution was a project, it was an initiative at her school where the program replaced, basically redesigned the student fitness room in her school's gym. And she replaced various pieces of exercise equipment with equipment that could generate electricity. And so she had two goals. First goal was to decrease the carbon footprint of the school by generating a certain amount of electricity and putting it back into the power grid. And so overall reducing the electricity consumption of the school. But her second goal, because the reality is that teenagers' muscles are not super strong, and they can't actually create that much electricity just from their muscles alone. And so her second goal was to raise awareness for how precious electricity is. One of the features in these, to give you an example, let's say you're riding a stationary bike. You can actually plug your phone directly into the bike, and it'll charge your phone as you pedal. And so a student might pedal for 30 minutes and only charge their phone 1%. And so this is a way for students to really see the value, see how difficult, see how precious electricity is, and value it a little bit more. And so those were her two goals. When she was applying for university, she was very unique. She might have been the only student in the whole world who had something similar to this. And so she ended up going into Wharton. So let's pretend hypothetically if she did apply to Harvard, let's score her. So we won't open up a poll for academics because I already said that she is very, very similar to Walter. So she's already about a 2. But let's do extracurricular and personal together. What would we score her for extracurricular? This is everything that is done outside of the classroom. And then what would we score her for personal, which is overall how interesting you are as a candidate. All right, so 1 is the highest, 6 is the lowest. You could answer both of these questions. Just place a guess what you think are Yanni, sorry, not Walter, are Yanni's scores for these two categories. All right, so get your answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, Here we go. A majority of you said that uh, extracurricular wise, very strong. Two, a couple of you said that you should get a one for extracurriculars. And then personal, majority said one. Extra, and then second place was two. And so this is how we scored her for extracurricular and personal. And actually, we actually had a lot of debate internally about whether it should be personal one and extracurricular two, or extracurricular one, personal two. Really, we think it can go both ways. And so everybody was very close. But one thing that we want to notice about this scoring is that extracurricular and personal tend to be very strongly correlated with each other. That as your extracurricular score goes up, your personal score will also naturally go up. And if you think about it, it makes sense that if you've done a lot of extraordinarily impactful things and getting a very high extracurricular score, you are naturally going to be more interesting to the admissions officers. And so your personal score will be very high. If you've had very little impact in the world, then your personal score is naturally going to be very low because there's fewer things for the admissions officers to look at. And so a strong correlation between these two categories. Athletic, we won't necessarily talk about that. Yanni's athletics were actually worse than Walter's. Because her school is not as competitive as Walter's school in terms of actual outcomes of the sporting. And so we'll open up another poll in just a moment about what do we think Yanni's chances are, or were, I guess, of getting into Harvard if she had applied. So is it 1%, 5, 10, 20, 50, or 75? Take a moment, think about it, and get your answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Close the poll. All right. Awesome. A majority of you said 50%. This is actually a little bit of a trick question because we actually gave you the answer a few slides ago. Her overall chances are 75%, if you get a 1 in any category, your overall chances are 75%. We'll also show you how we derive this percentage as well as Walter's 10%. Okay, so this statistic also came out of the Harvard admissions trial. We thought we would share. So if you have a 1 in any category, or just 1, your overall chances are 75%. But if you really, really work super duper hard and get 4 2s, everything is a 2 across the board. Like this is like your ultimate well-rounded student. If you have all 2s, your overall chance is 68%, which is very, very high. But we can very clearly see that it is more effective, more efficient to optimize in one category than it is to try to be really good in all of the categories. And so these numbers came straight out of the trial as well. So let's look at the overall Harvard admissions numbers. And so this is also released from the trial, but Harvard, I believe, releases this data on a yearly basis. We cleaned up the numbers a little bit so that it is easier to read. We rounded things to the nearest 100 or nearest 1,000 sometimes. And so that's why, for those of you who do very quick mental math, if you divide 1,900 by 43,000, it's actually not 4.6. It's because of our rounding that equation is a little bit off. But overall, Harvard gets 43,000 applicants every year, but they only have about 1,900 empty seats, spots to fill for these students. And so very first round of the admissions process is actually usually a software step where software will very quickly scan through your application and basically gauge if you are above or below the minimum. And if you're above the minimum, then your application moves on to a human reader. But if you're below the minimum, then you get disqualified immediately. In this group, there's about 29,000 students that are just not above that minimum threshold. And that threshold is not a perfect score. It's far from it. It's actually lower than you might think. But a lot of people apply to Harvard because it's Harvard, and some people just want to give it a try. In this group, there are about 25 students who still get in. Like maybe your dad donates a building, or maybe a new dorm, or maybe a dining hall. And so there are always some students who get in. So we don't necessarily need to talk about them very much. But once your application moves beyond this automatic filtering stage to the first human reader, we call this step first read. So during first read, these admissions officers have one very clear instruction, which is to pick out the special students. And these are the students where they are just really extraordinary in some way. And we've actually talked to a number of admissions officers who have admitted to us that they've let students into their respective universities just so they could get coffee with them in the fall when school starts, because these students are just so extraordinary and so interesting that that these admissions officers just want to meet them. And so if that is the reaction to your application after it's read during this first read stage, then you would be put into this separate pile of special students. And every year there's about 700 of them. There's always some extenuating circumstances. So about 525 of them get in. And so that's why on average across all the years, the acceptance rate for this group is about 75%. All right, and then the next round of the application process in the US is what they call it committee. This is where literally a committee of admissions officers will sit around a table and debate every single student. And this is why the US university admissions process is so extraordinarily long. That like the UK, Asia, it takes like a month or so to get your results. But in the US, it takes the better half of a year sometimes because they're debating every single student. And they're debating them because all of the students that are left are really awesome, but they're well-rounded, and they're basically all Walters. And when they're all extraordinary but well-rounded, the issue that admissions officers face is these students are all so similar to each other. And so it really becomes like splitting hairs, and it's very hard to differentiate between these students. And so 13,000 applicants left, and only about 1,300 empty spaces or empty seats. And so this group, the overall admissions rate is about 10%. Okay, and so these are the overall numbers. And so these are the overall numbers for Harvard, but for international students, it is a little bit different. So Harvard's defense in their court case is their argument to for the judge was Asian students have to have higher test scores because their personal scores are on average universally lower. And that's why they need to compensate for their lower personal scores with, oops, gonna get that light back on, lower personal scores with higher academic scores or higher scores elsewhere to compensate for that. And it's, if you think about it, actually, it kind of makes sense intuitively that students out of Asia, they tend to compete with each other in very similar ways. They tend to are all competing on the academic track, all trying to get that next highest test score. Their extracurriculars tend to be very similar. They're all part of the same clubs and doing the same extracurricular activities. They all play violin, they all play piano, all play badminton, all do calligraphy, all these activities that there's nothing wrong with. These are all excellent activities, but because everybody is so similar, it lowers the overall chance to stand out because it makes those activities so common. And so that's Harvard's defense. Personal rating, I'm just gonna touch on these very quickly. Your personal score comes from four main parts of the US application process. The biggest one is personal statement. This is the main part of the application, the part that students spend a majority of their time on. The second part is the letters of recommendation. This is recommendation letters from your teachers, from your counselor. As a former classroom teacher, I can attest that when I was teaching, I spent 5 years teaching in one of the top public schools in Michigan, and so I had students from my class go on to Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, all these top universities. And I had many Asian students in my various classes, and they were all very, very good at school. Some of the top scorers across the board, but they tended to be a lot weaker in terms of their participation in class or their ability to manage their relationship with teachers, me in particular. And so when I sat down to, if they asked me to write their letters of recommendation, I'd always be more than happy to. But as I wrote it, there were very few things that I could say about them other than they're a really hard worker. They have really good work ethic. They are really good at taking tests. Um, and because their interactions with me were so limited. And so letters of recommendation, super duper important for the personal rating. Third one is the additional information. This is a section of the Common App. Actually, pretty much all of the application platforms have an additional information section, but this is the most commonly skipped section. And we always recommend students to put something here, especially if whatever is makes you unique has certain statistical components to it, certain data. You'd want to put it there because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. The last component is the interview. More and more universities are requiring interviews from their applicants, especially international students, because they are deathly afraid of the phenomenon where students pay for their applications to be written by someone else. And so they basically require the interview as a way to verify your application. And just a little insider information about the technicalities of how interviews work. The person that's interviewing you, they have never read your application. They have no idea what your application says. And the person who reads your application has no idea what the interview notes are if you did your interview before your application, before you submitted your application. So it's kind of this double blind scenario where both of these people are independently taking notes on who they think you are and what they think you're passionate about. And then a third person on the back end will kind of review the notes from these two parties and match to see, do these two people, are their perceptions the same? Is the passion that comes through on the written application the same as the passion that comes through on the interview? Because if it's not, you instantly get rejected because it's an immediate red flag of, oh, somebody else probably wrote this application for them. And so that's why the interview is so important. All right, so these are the actual numbers for domestic acceptance rate and international acceptance rate. We call these projected international acceptance rates because none of these three universities will ever publicly admit to their international acceptance rates, but there are two universities that will publicly admit, and that's MIT and Amherst. And because these five universities have very similar financial aid policies, their ratios are going to be very similar to each other of domestic to international. And so that's how we kind of projected these estimates. But the situation is quite bleak. If we see Harvard goes from 4.6, which is already very low, to an astonishingly low 1.57, Yale goes from 6.3 to 2.15, and Princeton goes from 5.49 to 1.87. Common question that we get, and I'll just answer this preemptively, is what counts as an international student? So US admissions, they'll two departments in the school will give you the international label. One is the finance department, which is totally based on your citizenship. So if you're a US citizen, you're labeled as domestic. If you don't have a US citizenship, then you're labeled as international. And this is because the school will have to apply for a student visa for you if you don't have US citizenship. And so it's a different set of financial instruments. And so they'll put you on the label you as international if you need a visa of any kind. The second department that labels you is the academic department, which is based on the school that you attend. So if you attend a high school in the United States, then you are labeled a domestic student. But if you attend a school outside of the United States, then you're labeled an international student. With one key exception, is that every country has one school that is sponsored by the US State Department. And that school is classified as a domestic school when applying. And so for Hong Kong, it is Hong Kong International School. For mainland China, it's Shanghai International School. For Taiwan, it's Taipei American School. So every independent region will have its own State Department sponsored school. And so that's how the international label works. If either department gives you the international label, then overall you are an international student. Okay, good. So that said, so after seeing this slide, it might look very depressing in terms of your chances of getting into a top university. But the situation is actually within this there's an opportunity, and that is most of your peers are going to be competing on the academic, still competing academically, where they're really trying to go from a two, like to like really spend thousands of hours to go from a 2 to a 1. And our suggestion is to not do that, is to not compete in this traditional way, and to work on your personal score, to try to be more interesting, to figure out what is interesting about you and develop that, for a couple of reasons. Number one is, if everybody's doing this and you do something different, you're automatically going to be more interesting. But the second thing is that it's kind of a 2-for-1 deal, where if you improve on this, you automatically get better in the extracurricular as well. And so you just get a little bit more bang for your buck. And so that's why we recommend to focus on the personal. If everybody's going one way, go a different way. All right. And so if you're still not convinced, let's look at Harvard publications directly. So Dean Fitzsimmons, longtime dean of the Harvard admissions department, and he retired a number of years ago. And before he retired, he gave this interview to the New York Times. This is a quote lifted directly from that article. He said, "Each year we admit about 2,000 applicants. We like to think that all of them have strong personal qualities and character, that they will educate and inspire their classmates over the 4 years of college, and that they will make a significant difference in the world after they leave Harvard." Okay, so I highlighted this last sentence because that's what like Harvard is. It's what every university is looking for, from like Harvard all the way down to like unranked college or university. Is they're all looking for people who will change the world after they graduate. They're all looking for the future Steve Jobs, the future Mark Zuckerberg, future J.K. Rowlings of the world. And because that's how they get famous. Harvard is only Harvard because of so many US presidents graduating from there. Stanford is only Stanford because so many famous Silicon Valley CEOs came out of Stanford. And so every college admissions department, they are doing a predictive job. They are trying to predict who you can be 10 years down the line, 30 years down the line, 50 years down the line, who you can be. And from their perspective, the best way to predict your future achievement is to look at your past achievement. If as a high school student, you've only been able to take tests, and you're really awesome at taking tests, it's actually very risky to take a student like that, because in real life, there are very few tests left. So you might be very successful, but you might not be very successful either. And so it's risky. But if you've done something, if you've demonstrated the capacity and the ability to develop your passion and purpose and then do something with that, then you become an entirely different kind of student, from the college point of view. The second part of this is, this earlier sentence, that they will educate and inspire their classmates. This is the other thing that admissions officers are looking for. We've talked about being well-rounded. Many people think that well-rounded is the best way for these elite universities, and it is true to a certain extent. But these admissions officers, they're not looking for well-rounded students. They're looking for a well-rounded class. They're trying to find the best in every category for that incoming class of freshmen. So they're looking for the most extraordinary of this type, the most extraordinary of this other type, because that is how they inspire each other. So if you imagine 3 students doing a group project together, one of them is a very accomplished physicist, who's done like physics Olympiad and written research papers and all of that. Another student is a very accomplished dancer, someone who's danced in various competitions and various venues. And the third one is an accomplished writer, someone who's published in like a novel, magazines, whatever. And so these 3 students get together and do a group project, there is a very real chance that they will create something extraordinary. But if you get 3 Walters together, 3 students who are all well-rounded together, it's very unlikely that they'll inspire each other because they're too similar. They've all had very similar experiences as each other. They've all taken the same classes. They've all joined the same clubs. They've all like more or less lived the same K through 12 life. And so in those cases, it's very hard for them to inspire each other. And so that's the other thing that admissions officers are looking for. All right, and so if you're still not convinced, if you go to Harvard's website, there's a section under admissions called "What We Look For." and they lay out exactly what they look for in terms of candidates. And if you go on that website, you will not find a single mention of 4.0 GPA, 36 ACT, 1600 SAT. They just won't say that because that's not who they're trying to recruit. Instead, you'll see things like, do you have initiative? Are you a self-starter? Do you have direction? Do you care deeply about something? And this is directly from Harvard themselves. These are the kinds of students that they are looking for. Now, a quick caveat is I don't want anybody to leave today thinking that academics are not important anymore, especially if there's any students in the audience leaving here and being like, oh, I don't need to study anymore. The reality is that these are still schools and they care about academics, but they don't only care about academics. And so as long as you are above that minimum threshold, you're okay. As long as a human reads your application, then you stand a very good chance, especially if your profile is very interesting. All right, so how do we do this now? What is this other approach? How do we strategize? How do we prepare for and build this different kind of profile? So most applicants are very well-rounded. They try to do a little bit of everything, which kind of makes sense because if I don't know what I want, it's a very natural reaction to try to do a little bit of everything to kind of play it safe and spread myself out. But the key is actually to know what you want, to know who you are, and to really excel in that category, and be very spiky, very outstanding in that way. All right, and so how do we become this kind of student? We define Spike as purpose plus project. Okay, so this is a very important like definition, because many students when they're like they might not have done anything in high school, and so during college application season, they're trying to reflect and think about what they care about to really kind of craft this sense of purpose, and to put it down on their application essays, but they haven't actually done anything, and so their purpose, it's very abstract, it's very like insubstantial because of that. On the flip side, some students have done things, they have an extraordinary project, but they didn't necessarily connect it to some deeper meaning within them. And in that case, it actually, we've seen many students like this. In that situation, you actually run the risk of coming across as very hollow or artificial. Because if someone sees your project and then asks you questions about it and you're not able to really exude the passion that one would expect someone who did that extraordinary thing to have, then you run the risk of coming across as like, oh, maybe someone else did this project for them, and that the whole thing can potentially backfire. And so we believe that to really stand out, to have a spike, you actually need both purpose, have purpose, and a project to go with it. And so on the purpose side, two key components are it's internal and external. Internal, it needs to be very meaningful to you as a person, like individually, but it also needs to be impactful on the external side. It needs to make a difference in some number of people's lives, because if you find a lot of purpose in something, but it doesn't impact anyone, it doesn't do anything, then the purpose is very, very weak. We believe purpose is very directional and very impactful. And on the project side, there's three components. First one is persistence. That really good projects, they are long time commitments. It's very, very hard to do an extraordinary project in 2 weeks, let's say, because it's very obvious that like, oh, this was just thrown together. And so something that is long-term and shows your commitment and perseverance. Initiative, that it shows your ability to go from idea to reality, which is very, very difficult because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of planning, a lot of intentionality to do that. And the last one is impressiveness. It has to be uncommon. It has to be very extraordinary. Whenever we tell Yanni's story, the first reaction is always, wow, that's so cool. And so the impressiveness rating is automatically very high because it's very uncommon for a high school student to do what she did. And so we're going to break down impressiveness into an equation because our team is full of super nerds and we like equations. And so impressiveness. We're going to begin with impact plus expertise. So you have to be able to make some sort of impact, as I said earlier, but you also have to demonstrate that you are an expert. You have the technical chops, the know-how within this space. That you have a deep understanding of the field. And so we start with impact plus expertise, but then we multiply this, the sum of these two by the amplification. And so this is how well the word is able to spread, how well this idea is able to get out there and actually permeate the ether and the ecosystem. This can be done through PR. This can be done by word of mouth, depending on the field. It can vary. But how is this idea spread? How is the impact spread? And then last is we raise it to the power of uniqueness. And this is the most important, the most like game-changing variable in here, that if your idea is very unique, very true to who you are, it's naturally going to be more rare, and that is what is going to really accelerate your idea's impressiveness, because it'll be just you. The whole world will have just you with this outcome. And so this is our equation. Internally, we use this to rate our student spikes. And so this is to give you an idea of like what counts as impressive. All right, so let's use this framework and analyze Yanni. So meaningfulness. Her Kingswood Revolution was extraordinarily meaningful to Yanni because of her own personal medical condition and what the role of fitness played in that. And so personally extraordinarily meaningful. Impact-wise, she was able to not just only affect her school, but her entire like network of schools that her school is a part of. And then afterwards, she actually productized her process and the school, so that schools around, like local schools around her, were able to pick it up and implement such a program as well. Persistence. Yanni actually scored very low in terms of persistence because Yanni actually began our program summer between junior and senior year. She started very late, but she was very dedicated, very ambitious, and so we let her in, and she finished her whole spike in just under three months. But she worked full time from the time she woke up to the time she went to sleep every single day on this. But where she kind of was able to take a shortcut was she was able to build on something that was long-term. Her spike itself was not a long-term project, but it built on this condition that she had had since she was a child. And so in that way, it was persistent. And then fourth is initiative. She created this whole thing from the ground up, networked with different people at her school, with manufacturers to actually build the exercise equipment, and designers to redesign her gym, and various funds and foundations to raise money. And so a lot of initiative went into play. And then impressiveness, she was able to just be very impressive, her idea itself and the execution of that idea. Good. So then these are just some other quick examples. The real, as an educator, what gets me really excited about like this approach is that like every student can be themselves, and it really celebrates the individual student, and it's not a zero-sum game. They're not all competing for like a few limited resources. Every student can be unique in their own way, and really discover themselves along through the process. And so we had one student who was really interested in karate, and so he built a karate spike. Another student who was really into AI and jazz piano, and so he did an AI plus music spike. Another student who was really into writing published a book, but put it together in a really innovative way, and so book publishing spike. Another student interested in psychology and stress, and so she created a program at her school for reducing stress and improving student wellness. And then this cosplay art series, let me just get into this one a little bit more. So this student is based in Taipei, and attended an IB school. And she is actually a senior right now, about to head off to college in the fall. And her passion is was photography and cosplay. For those of you who don't know, I had to learn what cosplay was from working with this student. But cosplay is where you design and build and make these costumes, and then you kind of act out these scenes, and you take pictures. It's very photography centric, and you use these photos to kind of tell a story. It's very popular for people to dress up as like their favorite characters in like either animes or movies, and to like kind of create their own stories with these characters. And so this student, her name is Julia, and she was really interested in cosplay, but she was also she felt very strongly about the social perception of single parent like households. She herself grew up in a single parent home. Just her mom raised her, and she always felt a lot of stigma around that there was always this kind of like hush hush attitude towards her, and whenever the topic came up. And so she created this art gallery to really harness her passion for cosplay and to tell this story of being a single of a parent growing up in a single parent household. She called her gallery "We Don't Talk About That," because it's to kind of pay homage to how it's a topic that few people will willingly talk about. And so meaningfulness, very, very meaningful to her, something that she really wrestled with, and formative to our identity since she was very young. In terms of impact, Julia's impact was actually not very big. She did these galleries, in one in Taipei, one in Hong Kong, one in Beijing, and one in New York. But in terms of attendance, it weren't these huge like gala style exhibits. They were probably like 40 to 50 people each. And so in terms of total impact, is actually not very big. But we'll get down to impressiveness. What she did very, very well is the amplification part of the impressiveness equation. Every single gallery that she put together, she invited the press. And many reporters showed up because her story was so interesting and so unique. And so the most notable, she got Yahoo News to send a reporter to her Taipei gallery. And when admissions officers looked at her application, they would Google her name. Every admissions officer will Google your name as well. And so be sure to clean up your digital footprint if there's anything you don't want them to see before you apply. But whenever these admissions officers Googled Julia's name back in the fall, the top like 10 hits would all be of her spike. From various publications. And so that is what she did extraordinarily well. And that's what really carried her spike to really high impressiveness. And this photo right here, this is I like to point this out because this is taken by the Yahoo a photographer who showed up. And if you look very closely, that gentleman who is standing in the foreground, a little bit blurry, that's me. I went to our gallery just to say hi, and that's my claim to fame. Is my shoulder and my back were prominently featured in one of her key articles, and so that's Julia's story. And so how do we enable this? How do we set it up so that students are actually able to achieve these extraordinary outcomes of having a purpose and a project? The first big thing is time. Every student who goes through our program is very limited in terms of time. I'm sure many of you are very overscheduled because you're ambitious, and ambitious students tend to do a lot of things. And so the first thing is to re-examine how you use your time. Every student has the same amount of time. Nobody can get 28 hours out of the day. Everyone has the same amount. And so it becomes more of a question of what are you doing with your time? Are you spending it on things that are making you truly unique, and really like accentuating those qualities, or are you spending your time doing things that everybody else is doing as well? And so something to consider for time. One really quick tip in terms of time saving, for those of you in the US AP like program at your school, the quickest way to save time is to just take fewer AP classes. I know that's very controversial because the general trend globally is to take as many AP classes as you can possibly fit into your schedule. But the reality is that the difference between an AP class and a regular class per year in terms of time is roughly 200 hours. And so if you can take just one less AP class, you save 200 hours. You can do something else with that. We do recommend, though, that you do take the hardest classes that you can within the scope of your profile. And so if you are trying to build, let's say, like a like Julia, a very artistic profile, then you might want to take AP European History, AP English, AP Art, Studio Art, but you might not need to take certain other AP classes like AP Chemistry or AP Music Theory. And that's okay. You still want to take chemistry as a required class in high school, but you might not need the highest level of that. So that's just a quick suggestion for how to optimize your schedule a little bit more instead of feeling the need to spread yourself out and do the APs of everything. The second way to enable building a spike is ownership. It really needs to be your own as a student. And this is actually a very difficult challenge for many parents because as parents, many of you are very, very successful, very awesome human beings, and you want your kids to be very successful as well. And so there is that pressure to kind of give them their purpose of like, oh, like I know you very well. This is what I think you should do. This is what I think you're well suited for. But what we've seen is that if it is not if it does not come from the student originally, then it will never be fully theirs. And spikes are difficult to do. If they were easy, everybody would do them. And so when the difficulties occur, if it is not fully theirs, then there's a very real chance that they'll quit and they'll give up. And so ownership is very, very important. We as coaches, actually, in our program, we're very, very sensitive to this, that we recognize that coaches have certain things that they're excited about when they're working with students, and they have to keep that under control because we don't want to influence students in any direction. It has to be fully there. So ownership is very important. The third thing is support. Obviously, some students are able to do this fully on their own, but even the ones that are doing it on their own, they do have a support network around them, whether it's parents or teachers or school resources or programs like ours that are kind of working in the background to support them and teach them different methodologies and things. We do recommend to have some sort of support, whether it's formal or informal. All right, so this is how we enable it. I'm happy to talk in much greater detail about all three of these points later on, but to kind of sum up what we've been talking about tonight is in terms of these top universities, what we found in our experience and through the Harvard admissions trial is that the best strategy, the one that is universally effective, is to be purpose-driven. That is the best way to stand out instead of doing the rat race of trying to either be really good at everything or just trying to be really good at academics. To be purpose-driven is the most important thing. All right, so part three, we're beginning to wrap up now. It's just a really brief introduction of the Spike Lab. And so we call ourselves the Spike Lab because of spikes. We believe very strongly in like building these purpose-driven innovators for life. And so our program is, yes, it is about building spikes in high school, ultimately used for college admissions. But we also are passionate about, and we take a lot of pride in the skills that we help students develop along the way, that those are the skills that are going to really be with them for the rest of their lives. And so we take that part maybe even more seriously than the college admissions part because it's so important. This process is one that we know works. We have overall, from all the students who have been through our program, 91% admitted into one of their REACH schools. So this is like one of their top choice schools. 91% of our students get into at least one of their top choice schools. And 52% of them get into their ED schools, which is their early decision school. And these are some of the schools that we've gotten students into: Harvard, Stanford. The ones at the bottom may not be as recognizable. RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, very good design art and design school. In Parsons, also a very good design school in New York City, and London School of Economics. We've helped students with UK apps, Canadian applications, Europe, I think even Australia, but we do specialize in the United States because US college apps are the most complicated, and the most, because there's no standard process for the US. Every college sets their own method, and sets their own standards. And so that's where we specialize in. All right, so Lloyd and I are the founding coaches. Lloyd is Stanford MBA. He approaches this more from the innovation entrepreneurship angle. I approach this more from the education angle as a former classroom teacher. And so the two of us form a really great duo. The rest of our coaching staff are all really awesome people. They themselves have all graduated from top tier universities, and they all have experience at the intersection of education and entrepreneurship. We're very selective with our coaching hires. We like to joke that to be a coach at the Spike Lab is twice as hard as it is to get into Harvard. Our admittance rate is about 2%. 2% of the coaches who apply get the job. And so we're very selective. To give you just a quick zoom in on two of our coaches, this is Jane Chen. She is founder of this company called Embrace. If you like this little thing here that looks kind of like a sleeping bag, it is a baby incubator for premature babies. And she designed this to be deployed in developing countries, where electricity and all of the things that make modern hospital incubators work might not be very reliable or very stable. And so through this, she was able to save something like 300,000 babies from dying because they were born prematurely. And so she was recognized at one point at the White House. She got to meet President Obama, and makes me super duper jealous. But she's one of just one of many of our extraordinary coaches. Another one coach that I want to highlight who was more of a creative expression background, Spencer Whale. He is currently a director in New York City. Not all the theaters are closed right now, but he was and still will be when they reopen, a director. And so he has a lot of experience with creative endeavors, working with writers and artists of various kinds. And he also is his other sort of claim to fame is he is the youngest inductee into the U.S. Inventors Hall of Fame. And so that is Spencer. And we like to, so our coaches, even though they all have extraordinary backgrounds, we take a lot of pride in the fact that our coaches can coach any kind of student in any subject, whether they are really interested in finance or really interested in acting or really interested in computer science. It doesn't matter, because our coaches are not there to provide students with answers. They're there to ask the most critical questions. And so 2 years ago, I was working with a student who was interested in AI, machine learning, and jazz piano. And to this day, I still know zero things about either of those topics, but I was still able to coach him because I didn't need to know anything about machine learning or jazz piano, because I was pushing him along with the most critical questions, thinking about when he didn't have enough users, what were all of the possible factors, and brainstorming various methods, and then setting up experiments for him to test these ideas in smaller scale, and then narrowing the field and ultimately deciding on a solution. And so that's the kind of work that our coaches do, is to ask the most critical questions along the way. When students do need technical expertise, we have an extraordinary professional network behind us. And so we're able to connect students with experts in the field on a moment's notice. To give you an example, this student at one point, at the very beginning, he wanted to talk to a actual AI engineer. So we connected with him with this AI engineer working out of a startup in Silicon Valley. a student from just a few weeks ago was doing a journalism spike, and she wanted to talk to a real life journalist about how they do fact checking and how they deal with fake news. And so we were able to connect her with one of the editors at the Washington Post. And so that's just to give you an idea of like that there is technical support as well, but our coaches they're there to really just facilitate and support the questions to move the students forward. And the other thing, we call our staff coaches because we think that it is a more appropriate descriptor of what they do. Our coaches they're part teacher in that they'll teach students various frameworks and problem-solving methodologies to move their project forward. But they're also part teammate. They will actually roll up their sleeves and work with the student, whether it's analyzing data or setting up meetings, doing phone calls, all these things. Your coach will work right alongside the student. And so this is very different from some of the operations that we've heard about in mainland China, where someone will kind of architect this project for you, and they just hand off the instructions. It's like, now go do it, go execute it on your own. We're right there along the way, because the reality is that the ideas will shift and change as the students are doing it, because it's based on their passion. And these high schoolers, their sense of passion is still very, very nascent, very underdeveloped. And so as they're working, they will develop it. And so they'll very naturally either slightly shift direction or gain focus in a particular area, and that will change what their spike becomes. And so we're with students every step of the way. And so our methodology, our key difference from the more traditional college prep operations is that traditional college counseling begins in around 12th grade. Some of the better ones will begin in the second half of 11th grade. But we believe that this is their main focus is actually not on the profile itself, but more on the exterior, on the packaging of that profile. And so at the Spike Lab, we like to start much earlier. We work with students as early as 5th grade. It's a little bit of an exception, but like 7th or 8th grade, perfectly fine time to start. A majority of our students come in as 9th or 10th graders, but we will still work with older students like Yanni, who joined even later than now, of like summer right before senior year. We take it on a case-by-case basis, thinking about how ambitious the student is, how coachable they are, and really what are their expectations? What are they trying to get out of this experience? All right, so our Spike coaching is split into these 6 main stages: self-discovery, which is figuring out who you are, what you're passionate about; identification, figuring out how that passion can translate into a spike; validation, this is where we do like business modeling, basically, testing out the idea in small scale to validate various elements of it before investing the time and energy to actually build it. This greatly reduces the risk of the idea. And then launch, to actually build the thing and put it out into the world. Then traction, this is where enough people are using the idea and it has enough of an impact for it to be sustainable, for it to be a real thing. And last is scale. How do we build additional layers on top of that initial outcome so that the spike gets bigger and bigger? So we're going to use Yanni as a backdrop for this and kind of zoom in on how she experienced the program. For stage 1, she came to us with a ton of different interests. She played on the basketball team, rowed crew, she's on student government, she just did an electric vehicle internship. And we actually, when she first came in, we thought she was going to do a artistic spike because she was already a very celebrated artist and poet. She had actually been published in various magazines already. And so we assumed that she would do an art spike. But she decided ultimately that she was most passionate about sustainability and fitness. And so during identification, she, like many students, we weren't super sure and super confident in her sense of what she wanted to do. And so we had her do mini spikes. And these are small scale versions of spikes to get students real experience with that within that field so that they can make a more informed decision about whether or not it's the right thing for them. And so she had 4 mini spikes. First one is a Paris Climate Agreement, but for high schools, building this like kind of alliance of high schools to agree on certain waste and pollution standards. And the second one is a green roof. Green roofs they're very popular in Singapore right now. It's basically growing a lot of plants on the roof of a building to make it cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, and to reduce carbon dioxide in the air as well. The third idea was ultimately her green gym idea, what eventually became Kingswood Revolution. And then the fourth one is more bike lanes. She loves riding a bike. And so she wanted to work with her local city government to increase the number of bike lanes on the roads so that life would be easier for cyclists. And so as she was working, she very quickly, like within the first week and a half, discovered that she has no aptitude for growing things and that everything was dying under her care. And so she quickly abandoned the green roof idea. And this is very normal. We actually encourage students to abandon these mini spikes as soon as there's anything that gives them pause or is a red flag. The next thing she abandoned was the bike lanes idea because she started talking to various people in the city government and she realized that government is very slow. And in order to do this, it would take her about 4 or 5 years to get these new bike lanes installed because of zoning, because of like regulations and whatnot. And so it would be too late. She'd already be almost done with college at that point. And so she abandoned that idea. The Paris Climate Agreement, she actually almost was like ready to go with that. She'd figured it all out, but she realized in the end that she was most passionate about this green gym idea. So that's the idea that she ended up going with and executing. And then stage 3, she needed to validate her idea. And so this is sort of our trimmed down version of a business model or a business plan. We get students to think about who am I serving? Who's the audience? Where am I making this impact? What is their problem? All good spikes solve some sort of a problem. And then what is your solution? What does your solution actually look like? And how does it address all of these? And this is a great way of making sure there's alignment in the idea, that all of these 3 key components line up and fit together. Because if there's any misalignment anywhere, then the idea is much more risky. All right, and so Yani identified that student athletes were a potential user group for her because they are in need of new equipment. Her school's fitness room was kind of junky before, and equipment was all run down and old, and so these students were hungry for new equipment. And looking forward to that. Another group at her school were the foundations. She attended a school with a number of nonprofits were attached to, and these nonprofits every year they're looking for cool projects to fund. And they need to give this money out, so they're looking for really meaningful things to give money to. And then the last group were teachers. Teachers at our school, teachers at any school, they're always looking for more hands-on, interesting ways to teach their existing material. And so she felt like that her green gym idea could serve the needs of all 3 of these groups and address their problems. And so the way she tested this idea is we teach students the lean method, which is to start very small and to reduce waste. And so her very small beginning was she just got coffee with different stakeholders. She got coffee with her school's vice principal, with a couple of teachers, with a classmate, and just talked to them about her idea, verbally pitched it. Her coach worked with her to kind of practice this pitch and figure out how to describe it and what to say, what questions to ask. But basically through these coffee meetings, people were like, yeah, this looks pretty good overall. And so she read that as a green light to move forward. She did some modeling. We taught her how to do financial modeling, how to crunch the numbers, how to build basically a more thorough business plan for her idea. And so she took this and realized, okay, the numbers all check out. And so we moved the idea forward. And then she started drafting for proposals. She worked with her coach to figure out how to even write a formal proposal and how to make these very formal presentations before boards of directors. And so she started drafting proposals, getting all these meetings with various people, and from this she started to raise money. And so that was when she realized, like, yes, this idea can be real. And so she validated it. And then moving forward, she had a spike defense. This is a key part of our program. This is similar to a PhD defense where the candidate is basically asked these really, really tough questions and really put on the spot. And so for the spike defense, we bring in another coach, a different coach who doesn't know the idea yet and is really there to kick the tires and challenge the student in things that they might not have thought of. And so when students pass the spike defense, then they can go on to launch their idea. And so for Yanni, that meant getting board approval, recruiting teachers, securing her supplier, raising the necessary money that she needed, recruiting coaches, redesigning the whole gym, planning all of her marketing events or kickoff events for when the gym was finished, and then recruiting athletes to participate. And so once she had done all of this, she needed to get traction. And so she measured her traction in 4 ways. First one was through student feedback, how actual student athletes felt about the new facility, and then teacher participation. She really wanted this space to be something that many teachers could use, not just the gym teacher, not just the athletic coaches. She recruited the biology teacher to write lesson plans, to teach students about how calories become energy through the use of this fitness room. The physics teacher to teach about electricity and magnetism and how electricity gets generated through the use of this fitness room. Even the art teacher and English teacher ended up writing curriculum to go with this new space. And so whole school involvement. And so she was very keen on looking at the usage rates. Was this room actually being used throughout the day, or was it only at the end of the day after school, like most other fitness rooms? And then last thing she measured was how much money she raised. Because she wanted this thing to be sustainable, to be a long-term impact on not just the school, but the local community as well. So these are the 4 things that she mostly looked at. And then with scale, the way she increased her reach was she worked with the Henry Ford Museum. For those of you who you may have heard of Ford Motor Company, the Ford home, the Ford mansion, like where their family historically lived, was eventually turned into a museum because it's enormous. And Henry Ford Museum really took an interest to Yanni's project. And so they ended up building an exhibit around Kingswood Revolution to really showcase like what can be done on the school level. And then she also got a lot of press coverage with her local papers. I think with even the city, the regional newspaper as well, just covering and amplifying her idea. All right, and so that is how Yanni progressed through these 6 stages. Every student experiences these a little bit differently. Our program is fully personalized, so some students might have a longer or shorter self-discovery. Some students might have a longer launch period. Some students might need less time in identification because they already know kind of what area they want to work in. And so this is flexible and variable from student to student. And just to reiterate, Yanni eventually got into Wharton, which has it's very, very competitive and difficult to get into. And so, how to get started with our program? We are selective in a way, but not in the way that most programs are. We don't select based on academics at all. Some of our students are above average academics, but some of our students are below average. That's okay. We are mostly concerned about students who are ambitious, students who have strong opinions, and students who want to do things with their time. And so we start with an initial consultation. This is kind of like an interview, but also a consultation where we'll answer any questions there are about either our program or about high school or about college. And so after this consultation, we'll prepare what we call an initial coaching plan. And this is a rough framework and roadmap for what the program can look like for your student. As we said earlier, the program is fully personalized and customized to each individual's needs. And so we'll start by writing up a student analysis of like, who is this student, what are their needs, what is their profile like right now. We'll also make a coach recommendation where we'll, based on personality, experience, all of these factors, we'll make a recommendation from our coaching bench of who we think is the best fit for that student. And then we'll also outline a rough roadmap for when the student will do various components of the program. And this is a rough estimate. It's subject to change with the actual experience of the coaching. But based on experience of like similar age students or similar experience students, how they've progressed in the past. And so after the initial coaching plan, we'll do a follow-up meeting. There's usually a lot of questions that come up from that report. And then if everything looks good, we'll arrange what we call a meet and greet, which is a very informal meeting between the student and the coach, just to get to know each other a little bit. Usually it's very short, like 15 minutes, very casual. If the parents are interested, we'll also arrange a separate 15-minute meeting for the parents and the coach as well. We like to split it up because students are always, they act always a little bit differently when the parents are around. And so that's why we separate it. And then if everything looks good, then the coaching can begin. Once students are in the program, every 6 sessions, we'll prepare a progress report, which is an outline of what happened in the previous 6 sessions and what is coming up in the next 6. And then we'll also arrange what we call a success manager meeting. Every student, in addition to their coach, has a success manager who is someone working in the background to make sure mostly that the student is moving fast enough and to ensure quality in the experience. And so the success manager will know the student situation very thoroughly, and so they'll be able to talk to the parents about where the student is and kind of get the parent input as well if there's anything the parents are worried about or want us to know about, so that we can prioritize and address. This came in during the presentation, is I have one 9th grader and 10th grader. So as you just said, right now is the best time to start. Yes, I think it depends on the students. 9th grade and 10th grade tend to be the most common ages where students begin the spike coaching program, but I have to say it does vary from student to student. We have met some extraordinarily mature 8th graders before and some extraordinarily immature 11th graders. And so age is not necessarily the best measure, but if the student has like a certain amount of independent ability, has a certain amount of ambition, my suggestion would be to book that initial consultation. I will meet them, have a conversation with them, and make an assessment. Sometimes students are too young and I need a little bit more time to experience things. And in that case, we will just recommend to come back to us in 6 months or a year or more. All right, Grace is telling me next question is ready. What if my kid doesn't have any distinctive spike? Great question. This is the norm. Don't feel like everybody out there is already working on a spike. Spikes are extraordinarily difficult, and very few students come to us with a very clear passion and purpose yet. Almost every student comes with many shallow interests, but not a lot of deep passions. And so that's what our self-discovery stage is really focused on, which is helping them figure out who they are and what they stand for and what they care about and what gets them, what energizes them. And to do this, we have many different reflection exercises, and we approach it from different angles because passion and purpose are such abstract concepts. And through this like multi-perspective process, the student is able to catch a more complete glimpse of what their passion and purpose can be. And so it's totally okay if your kid does not have any distinct spike yet. I believe very strongly that every student, every person is unique, and it's just a matter of developing that and uncovering that. All right, next question. Can students truly build a spike project or something tangible within 12 weeks? It's a pretty short period. And what happens after 12 weeks? Yeah, so 12 weeks is definitely not enough to finish a spike. Yanni, as I said earlier, was an extraordinary special case. She is to this day still the fastest student to move through our program, but it was because when she started, we set certain conditions for her because she was already so late in the process. We told her we could coach her, but that she had to quit everything else and withdraw from every other summer program that she was already admitted to. And so she thought about it and she thought it was worth it. So she did Spike as her full-time job for the whole summer, essentially. And so but most students, on average, a spike takes about a year to a year and a half to complete, varying from student to student. Some of our younger students are in it for the long haul, 2, even 3 years sometimes. And our older students, roughly a year, sometimes half a year for our 11th graders who have had more life experiences already and have stronger self-reflection muscles and more independence muscles. Those are the students who can move a little bit faster. And so after the 12 weeks, Continuation is very flexible. They can either continue full-time if they feel like they need more robust support, or like the same level of robust support, or they can switch to part-time, which they have a certain amount of independence, but their coach is still always there every other week, or they can switch to flex, or just go on hold, and, or something like that. Is there another question, Grace? Okay. Another one. All right, given the coronavirus, admissions format will change a lot. What should we do then? What about summer programs? Any suggestions? Yes, so coronavirus has turned the world upside down, especially college admissions because of everything being canceled. And many universities, we're actually in the process of putting together a blog post about this right now, but universities are switching to test optional. Some universities are straight up just canceling their test requirements, so that you don't even have the option to submit a test score anymore. And some universities are making long-term announcements, like Tufts University, very good school. They've announced that for the next 3 years they will not require SAT or ACT test scores. And so there is a lot changing. We expect that even more will change. Even more change is to come. But the short-term impact is that a lot of summer programs have been canceled or switched to online. The online summer programs are a little bit tricky because they differ on a case-by-case basis. Some of them do make accommodations for international students, because if they're US programs, if they're online, it will be like in the middle of the night for Asia to participate. Some programs are making accommodations, but some are not. And so in that case, you're gonna have to make certain like decisions based on that. Our suggestion for the summer, because so many students are kind of trapped in their respective geography, and not able to travel, not able to go do what they necessarily originally planned on doing. Everybody's in the same boat, and so you have much more time available. And so our suggestion is to just like create something on your own. You'll never have another opportunity to have such a large chunk of uninterrupted time. And so do the hard self-discovery work, launch something. You don't work with us or not work with us. That's like it's more important to just be active. And so where the traditional ways of standing out are no longer even available, we recommend that students look for these non-traditional ways. And so whether it's, I think this summer in particular, internships are mostly full because everybody's fighting for them, and a lot of companies are not actually back in full swing yet. And so internships are less available. Research is also less available. And so doing something independently, I think this summer is going to be a really key thing. All right. Next question. I assume coronavirus outbreak will affect student spikes. How do they still run the project under all this craziness? Yes, all of our students have had to pivot with their spikes. We've had some students who are majorly affected and some who are like pretty minorly affected. We had one student who had to like cancel like this whole venue, this whole event that was planned, and she had to cancel last minute because of social distancing orders, and no longer allowing large groups to gather. And so it is difficult, but coaches are working with students very, very closely to make adjustments, to pivot accordingly. And so, for example, one student was working on a nutrition-oriented spike, and she originally was planning on working with NGOs to build these like nutrition kits, essentially for developing countries and places that had weak food security. But as Corona began to break out, a lot of the people that she was connecting with these NGOs actually withdrew back to their home countries, or were recalled rather by their home countries because of the outbreak. And so she pivoted and switched her focus to families, low-income families in her own city. And she's actually based in Hong Kong. And so she, like, especially when the outbreak first began, there were a lot of shortages of things. And in particular, from a nutrition point of view, she noticed that because she was still working with a couple of food pantries, that families who had food insecurity were eating more and more asymmetrical, imbalanced meals, where they tended to eat too much of one particular thing and not enough variety in their diets. And so, so she was working on developing these food kits that within one Ziploc bag contains every nutrient that a family of four needs for a whole meal. And she's just still in the process of developing it, but that's how her spike ended up pivoting because of the outbreak. And this is something that every student has to deal with. But I think it makes them stronger through the process. It makes them more flexible thinkers, more adaptive problem solvers. And so I think it will ultimately help them because it does also show that they've overcome some extraordinary difficulty as well on their journey, which only can help their personal score.